13 familiar faces, 13 hidden sentences. They smiled on screen, played heroes and villains, cracked jokes, delivered forecasts, and then vanished behind bars. Some served time quietly, others exploded in scandal. And one may never have gone at all. This isn't just a list of stars who fell. It's a backstage tour of British fame, failure, and the strange limbo where public trust goes to die. Because when the cameras stop rolling, what happens next isn't fiction. Before we step into these 13 stories, make sure you're subscribed, because this channel is basically a late-night archive of mysteries, scandals, and the things history tries to quietly forget. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Let's see how far across the world this strange little journey reaches tonight. 1. Leslie Grantham. The man who would become Dirty Den shot a stranger in the face before ever stepping onto a soundstage. Leslie Grantham, future soapland antihero and tabloid magnate, began his life in the spotlight the hard way by extinguishing someone else's. It was 1966, and Grantham, then a young British Army private stationed in West Germany, attempted to rob a taxi driver. The gun went off. The driver died. Grantham claimed it was accidental. The court didn't believe him. He was 19 years old. The sentence, life imprisonment. The press barely noticed. This was long before EastEnders, before BBC stardom, before he became the most watched villain in the UK. Grantham served roughly a decade behind bars, and it was inside those walls where time has no structure and identity has to be rebuilt brick by brick that he discovered acting. Prison theater became the rehearsal room for a second life. After release, he enrolled at drama school. By the mid-1980s, he was Dirty Den, smirking, scheming, and masterminding Christmas Day showdowns in front of 30 million viewers. A national icon built on a national blind spot. Grantham's past wasn't exactly hidden, but the full weight of it lingered in shadows. When scandals inevitably caught up and internet controversy, in the early 2000s being the most notable, the tabloids recycled his origin story with new relish. The murder wasn't just back in the headlines, it had been lying in wait the whole time. But here's the twist, the public never fully turned on him, maybe because Dirty Den was always supposed to be detestable. Maybe because Britain has a strange fondness for rogues with redemption arcs, especially ones that are never fully redeemed. His legacy remains split in two, the actor who came back from a killing, and the killing that never really left him. And yet, Grantham's story also opens a deeper question, one that Britain never quite answers. What happens when prison works? When the villain really does re-enter society, reformed and repackaged for prime time, do we applaud the transformation, or keep asking who gets to transform it all? Ricky Tomlinson never killed anyone, but his time inside would be even more public and even more political. 2. Ricky Tomlinson. He was jailed for picketing. Let that sentence sink in. Before the royal family made him a national treasure with a reclining chair and a one-word grunt, Ricky Tomlinson was one of 24 men locked up for taking part in a strike. It was 1972, the height of Britain's industrial unrest, and Tomlinson, then a builder and card-carrying trade unionist, joined the picket lines during a national building workers' strike. What followed was a government crackdown dressed up as law and order. He and the others were charged with conspiracy to intimidate and affray. The courtroom was political theater. The sentence, 2 years behind bars. Not for throwing a punch, not for violence. For standing in the wrong place with the wrong people at the wrong time, in a Britain terrified of working-class power. Tomlinson served his time. He emerged a changed man, politically sharpened, vocally bitter, and publicly ready to name names. For decades, he claimed the prosecution was orchestrated by the state. Secret files later seemed to confirm it. MI5 surveillance, blacklisting, a quiet war against loud workers. But the weirdest part? Ricky Tomlinson still became a star. His criminal record kept him off TV for years. He lost jobs, his house, his marriage. But in the 1990s, a strange reversal happened. The gruff ex-con became the face of working-class comedy. As Jim Royal, he turned laziness into protest art. As DCI Charlie Wise in Cracker, He lent real-life grit to fictional crime. Audiences didn't reject his past, they absorbed it into the character. And eventually, the courts did too. In 2021, nearly 50 years after the strike, his conviction was formally overturned. Too late to undo the prison sentence. Not too late to admit what it really was, a political punishment. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If Ricky's jailing was a mistake cloaked in legitimacy, how many others are buried beneath similar respectability? How many ex-cons are famous, not despite their convictions, but because those convictions gave them something the culture could mythologize? Stephen Fry knows what it's like to carry a sentence and a story, but his arrest was less about politics and more about panic. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for, curious, slightly suspicious, and up far too late. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And while we're digging through Britain's strangest backstories, tell me where you're tuning in from, and what time it is as you're listening. Because something tells me this isn't your average midday viewing. 3. Stephen Fry. Before he was the nation's clever uncle before QI, Blackadder, or the Oxford Union debates that made wit feel like a blood sport, Stephen Fry was a teenage runaway with a stolen credit card and a gift for self-destruction. It was 1975. He was 17. The offense was fraud. The sentence, a few months in youth detention at Pucklechurch Prison. Not quite the Dickensian origin story you'd expect from a man who would later be knighted for services to literature and broadcasting. But that's the paradox. Fry's criminal past didn't sink him. It became a strange kind of ballast, proof that brilliance could grow in wreckage. His own retellings, polished by decades of self-deprecating charm, tend to sand down the edges. He'd nicked a friend's credit card, went on a spree, got caught, and spent time locked away. The details are both clear and opaque. It's not that the facts are murky, it's that they never quite fit the expected arc. Because Fry isn't the usual redemption figure. He didn't claw his way back from ruin. He spiraled into chaos, landed in confinement, and then somehow sidestepped both self-pity and scorn. The sentence didn't define him. It folded itself into the narrative of a wayward genius who, for a brief time, lived on the knife edge between expulsion and expression. There's a cultural double standard here, of course. Most teenagers caught with fraud charges don't end up on Radio 4. But Fry was, even then, something else. Precociously articulate, deeply troubled, and shielded, at least in part, by the soft force field of poshness. Incarceration didn't brand him a menace. It branded him a misfit. That's not fairness. That's narrative convenience. And yet, he's never pretended otherwise. Fry's past, including his breakdowns and diagnoses, has always been part of his public self. Not performatively, not with PR gloss, but with an intellectual honesty that sidesteps absolution. The crime never disappears. It just gets reframed. Which leaves us with a lingering discomfort. If a teenage con man becomes a national icon, what does that say about who gets forgiven and why? Judy Carne didn't get the same treatment. Her fall wasn't softened by charm or rebranded through cleverness. It was public, it was chaotic, and it was cruelly unforgettable. 4. Judy Carne. Once upon a psychedelic time, she was America's British darling. Judy Carne, wide-eyed, quick-tongued, and permanently mid-eye roll, was the first person many Americans ever heard say the phrase, "Sock it to me." But behind the catchphrase, behind the wild fashions and lightning-fast sketch comedy routines on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, was a downward trajectory with no laugh track. Her fame peaked fast in the 1960s. She was the perfect export, British, bold, and just unhinged enough to seem hip in Nixon-era television. But the chaos wasn't just on screen. Carne's personal life unraveled publicly, with arrests, addiction battles, and a rotating door of tabloid-friendly disasters. By the time she was arrested at Heathrow Airport for drug possession in the early 70s, the British press had already begun writing her off as a lost cause. The conviction came with a 3-month sentence. She served 2, behind bars at Cookham Wood, not long by prison standards but culturally catastrophic. Unlike other stars who found a way to alchemize their prison time into gravitas or myth, Carne was left with only the stigma. Her reputation didn't harden into legend, it crumbled into pity. The narrative didn't forgive her. It merely moved on. The problem wasn't just the drugs, or even the jail time. It was the optics. Carne was a woman in a media era that pathologized female collapse and glamorized male dysfunction. The very qualities that made her lovable on-screen irreverence, impulsivity, that glint of mayhem, became liabilities when viewed through the lens of real-world trouble. Where Stephen Fry's youth detention became a footnote to genius, Judy's prison stint was rebranded as proof of personal failure. And yet, even in her downfall, there's something sharp-edged about Carne's legacy. She wasn't tragic in the weepy biopic sense. She was inconvenient, brash, and impossible to domesticate. That's what made her unforgettable. That's what got her punished. Her later life was quieter. She returned to Britain, wrote a candid autobiography, and lived far from the spotlight. But her time in prison, brief as it was, remains a symbol of how quickly fame curdles when the story stops fitting the script. Which brings us to Alan Lake, an actor whose downfall had nothing to do with drugs, and everything to do with a bar fight, and a reputation that refused to stay off the front page. 5. Alan Lake. Alan Lake could have played himself if anyone had dared write a script that bleak. A handsome, brooding actor with a dangerous glint, Lake was both the promise and the warning of 1970s British television. He had the look, the voice, the tragic romance. He also had a temper, a drinking problem, and a tabloid reputation built like a bonfire. By the time he was jailed for his part in a pub brawl, he was already teetering on the edge of self-destruction. The specifics of the fight weren't glamorous, just another flash of violence in an era that excelled at disguising dysfunction as charm. But the sentence, 18 months in prison, of which he served about a year, stripped away what was left of his public veneer. Not because it shocked anyone, but because it confirmed the image everyone suspected. Lake's notoriety wasn't just personal, it was marital. He was married to Diana Dors, herself a former tabloid goddess and eternal British Monroe. Together, they were a real-life soap opera. Glitter, scandal, tragedy. When he went to prison, it played like just another act in a doomed love story. And yet, what prison did to Alan Lake wasn't theatrical. It was corrosive. His already fragile career took a hit it never fully recovered from. Producers stopped calling. Casting agents quietly moved on. By the time he was out, the offers that came were few and mostly small. The industry had a way of pretending not to notice its damaged goods, but it never really welcomed them back. The irony? He was actually good, a compelling actor with depth, range, and presence. But talent doesn't always survive reputation. Especially not when reputation is fed on a loop of violence, booze, and prison headlines. In the years that followed, Lake's life unraveled in ways the tabloids never really understood, they just printed the outcomes. He became a cautionary tale, the kind whispered about in green rooms and remembered in memorial segments. But the sentence, the jail time, the violence, it wasn't a one-off scandal. It was a turning point no one turned back from. And as his story faded into the back catalogue of British celebrity collapse, another actor, less famous, less remembered, was about to walk a path just as bleak, only this time with drug deals, money laundering, and a very different kind of fall. 6. Chris Hargreaves. Chris Hargreaves didn't have a household name. He had a Coronation Street credit, a few bit parts, a soap career built on side characters and day player appearances. But then the credits stopped rolling, and the headlines took over. In 2016, Hargreaves was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison after being caught running a small but organized drug operation, cannabis, mostly. Plus charges related to money laundering and supply intent. It wasn't glamorous crime. It was logistics, street-level commerce. But the press latched on to the phrase they loved best. Ex-soap star turned drug dealer. The story practically wrote itself. Former actor swaps fake drama for real crime, TV land to underworld. And just like that, a career's worth of minor fame became a major cautionary tale. Hargreaves' case wasn't just about the crime, it was about how fast the industry forgets you once your usefulness expires. One day you're on set, filming over-rehearsed confrontations in a make-believe pub. The next, you're behind bars for something that happens in the alley outside one. The transition was seamless, almost poetic, if it weren't so real. The court didn't go easy on him, and neither did the media. Every story made sure to remind readers exactly where they'd seen his face before, even if it had only been for 5 minutes on a Thursday evening in the 90 seconds. That's the thing about ex-TV actors. They're public enough to punish, but too obscure to protect. After sentencing, Hargreaves disappeared from the entertainment industry completely. No redemption tour, no podcast confessionals. Just another name in the long list of "Where Are They Now" articles that end in a mugshot. His story doesn't inspire outrage or moral panic. It barely inspires memory. But maybe that's the point. Not every fall from grace is headline-worthy. Some are just slow collapses into invisibility, sped up by one bad decision, one sting operation, one moment when the door slams, and the role ends for good. But for Brian Regan, the fall was neither quick nor quiet. His story didn't fade into obscurity. It exploded into full-blown underworld scandal, complete with a gangland killing, a murder trial, and a role no actor ever wants to play: the accomplice. 7. Brian Regan. Brian Regan wasn't the kind of actor you'd expect to see linked to a gangland shooting. Then again, Britain's underworld has always had a flair for unlikely casting. Regan had a decent TV resume. Best known for a recurring role on Brookside, he drifted through British screens in the 80 seconds and 90 seconds, part of that familiar breed of steady, unglamorous performers who built their careers on regional dramas and reliable support roles. Not a star, but recognizable. The kind of face your mum might spot in a rerun and say, "Him again." But in 2012, Regan wasn't playing a part. He was in court, not costume. The charge: involvement in a real-life gangland killing. He wasn't the shooter. But prosecutors said he drove the gunman, helped cover tracks, and then tried to throw investigators off the scent. The technical term was perverting the course of justice. The moral weight, however, was heavier. The headlines practically begged for drama. Soap star caught in underworld web, TV villain turns real-life accomplice. And while the murder trial eventually cleared him of direct responsibility for the killing, he was still sentenced to nearly 5 years in prison. A supporting role, but in a crime that ended in someone's death. What made it all stick in the public memory wasn't just the crime, it was the timing. Regan's arrest happened years after his TV heyday, during a period when his name had faded from relevance. The case jolted it back, grotesquely amplified. In a perverse way, the scandal made him famous again. Not the kind of fame anyone wants, but in Britain's tabloid ecosystem, notoriety often outpaces merit. The courtroom was grim. The coverage was relentless. When the reporting ban lifted, the floodgates opened. He was, for a few weeks, the most talked-about ex-soap actor in the country. And then, as these stories often go, silence. No redemption tour, no tearful interviews. Just a man walking out of prison into a career that no longer existed. His story feels like the midpoint of something, a reminder that not all collapses are about ego or addiction. Some are about proximity, the wrong people, the wrong choices, the wrong place in the car. But the next story wouldn't be about proximity. It would be about responsibility, and a sentence that would remove a man from public life completely, with no ambiguity about guilt and no path to return. 8. John Alford. He was a teenage heartthrob once. John Alford had that 90 seconds charm, boyish face, cocky grin, and just enough edge to make him a fixture on shows like Grange Hill and London's Burning. He was the kind of actor who seemed destined to age into something bigger. Maybe not a superstar, but a mainstay, a lifer, someone who'd always have a place in the nostalgic backrooms of British TV. That version of Alford disappeared a long time ago. By the time his criminal case reached court in 2026, Alford wasn't a fixture of anything but the archives. The charges were serious. He was convicted of multiple sexual offenses involving underage girls. The trial was high profile, the coverage was intense, and the sentence, 8.5 years, was definitive. There was no ambiguity, no debate, no room for interpretation. This wasn't a tabloid scandal designed to titillate or speculate. It was a closed case, the kind that redefines a man's name so thoroughly that any previous career, any cultural footprint, is effectively erased. Alford didn't just lose his platform. He lost the permission to exist within public nostalgia. It's important to understand the shift here. Decades ago, similar cases were whispered about, softened, or buried. But post-2010s, Britain operates differently. The public appetite for accountability, especially in the entertainment world, has grown sharper, more surgical. There's less room for image management. When someone's convicted of crimes like this, the conversation ends. Alford's story now exists only in the past tense. He is not discussed as a performer, a former child star, or a could-have been. He is discussed in court documents, crime reporting, and public registries. His fall wasn't gradual, it was seismic and final. There's no clever ending here, no ironic reflection or bittersweet twist, just a complete severing of cultural memory from personal history. One day, he was a familiar face from after-school telly. The next, he was a case number. But what happens when someone burns their name not through abuse, but through ambition? When the crime isn't personal horror but public deception? That's where Philip Foster steps in. His face belonged to Brookside, but his downfall came from something far less dramatic and far more methodical. Fraud. Lots of it. 9. Philip Foster. Some actors disappear into obscurity. Philip Foster disappeared into a fraud investigation. In the 1990s, he was a minor name on Brookside, a familiar soap face in a decade flooded with them. Not a star, not even a major supporting lead, just another working actor doing the circuit. And then, he was gone. Not in the usual sense of fading careers or tabloid scandal, but in the literal paper trail sense. Years passed, and then he reappeared on the news. For something far more lucrative than soap scripts. Fraud on a massive scale. The headlines came in 2025. Foster had been sentenced to 8.5 years in prison for orchestrating a multi-million-pound scam involving sham modeling agencies. The scheme was slick, predatory, and methodical. Desperate young people were lured in with promises of stardom, charged upfront fees, and then abandoned with nothing. It wasn't just deceit, it was infrastructure. He'd built a whole machine around the illusion of opportunity. There's something uniquely cruel about this kind of con. It exploits hope, ambition, and the very dreams Foster once tried to live out himself. And that's the dark irony. He sold others the fantasy of fame using the residue of his own. A washed-up actor selling counterfeit stardom. You can't script that kind of symmetry. What made the story especially gripping was the scale. This wasn't a one-off. It was a sprawling, multi-year operation, complete with company fronts, false contracts, and enough victims to make it a national case. City of York investigators uncovered the whole thing with forensic detail, and the court didn't hold back. Foster was framed not as a tragic figure, but as a calculating manipulator who turned his industry knowledge into a business model for exploitation. There was no public apology, no statement of remorse, just silence, and a prison sentence that effectively closed the curtain on any chance of public rehabilitation. Because unlike some crimes that leave a sliver of ambiguity or room for redemption, Foster's didn't. His downfall wasn't about weakness, it was about strategy. But if Philip Foster's scandal was about trust betrayed on a structural level, the next man's story comes from an entirely different vault. It belongs to the era when abuse lived in plain sight, and no one asked the right questions until decades later. Stuart Hall was once the smiling face of Saturday night. Then he became something else entirely. 10. Stuart Hall. There was a time when Stuart Hall was British television. The booming voice, the theatrical gestures, the surreal chaos of "it's a knockout." He embodied a kind of family-friendly madness that defined a generation of BBC entertainment, loud, absurd, and endlessly watchable. But by the 2010s, Hall's legacy imploded. His name, once shorthand for campy nostalgia, became synonymous with the reckoning that overtook Britain's entertainment world in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal. Historic allegations, long buried, long unprosecuted, were suddenly at the center of a national inquiry into who knew what and when. Hall was convicted in 2013 for multiple indecent assaults. The charges, relating to incidents decades prior, led to an initial 15-month sentence. Public outrage saw that term doubled on appeal. And just like that, Hall's persona, once irrepressible, unshakable, shattered completely. The man who used to host games involving foam hammers and falling over in costume was now a face on the evening news, flanked by grim voiceovers and court sketches. His crimes weren't the murky kind the tabloids loved to speculate about. They were proven, on record, and the result was one of the most abrupt erasures in British media history. Hall didn't just fall from grace, he was actively scrubbed from it. TV archives were pulled, clips vanished, institutions distanced themselves with speed. There was no nuance left to debate, just a full stop. And yet, it took decades to get there. That's the part that sticks. Hall was in the public eye for half a century, beloved even, celebrated. He received an OBE, interviews, autobiographies, all while victims were living with memories no one believed, or worse, ignored. His conviction became a turning point not just for himself, but for how the public viewed the generation of entertainers who'd once been untouchable. In the space of one trial, a man once considered safe enough for family tea time became proof of how long systems can protect the wrong people. And as Britain reeled from the revelations, it became clear that Hall wasn't an outlier. He was part of a pattern. And the next name in that pattern? Even more deeply woven into the fabric of national life. Rolf Harris, a man who, for decades, seemed as wholesome as Sunday afternoon telly until he wasn't. 11. Rolf Harris. Rolf Harris was everywhere. For over 4 decades, his voice, his art, and his peculiar blend of music and mischief became fixtures of British childhoods. He painted the Queen. He hosted variety shows. He taught generations how to wobble a board and call it music. For many, he was more than famous, he was institutional. The kind of figure who showed up at charity events, royal functions, and Christmas specials like a warm cardigan nobody questioned. Until the questions came. In 2014, Harris was convicted of a string of indecent assaults, with offenses spanning decades. The trial was public, damning, and brutal in its clarity. He was sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison. Overnight, the national institution became a national reckoning. His OBE was stripped, his paintings were removed from gallery walls. Broadcast networks scrambled to erase decades of programming that once centered him as a friendly authority figure. But the most unsettling part wasn't the conviction itself, it was how long the myth had held. Harris had thrived in the era when celebrity insulated you, when affability was armor. He was the sort of entertainer whose persona was so deeply entrenched in public memory that the truth had to crash through layers of nostalgia just to be heard. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was cultural. The collapse of his legacy wasn't a rebranding, it was an obliteration. Footage that once charmed now felt eerie. Public performances turned into cautionary tales, and every old clip played like a warning we'd missed. There was no redemption arc, no final performance, no quiet goodbye. Harris died in 2023, disgraced and largely erased, his obituary split between the man he was and the damage he left behind. What remains is a lesson about how charisma can delay consequence, but never cancel it. And just when it seemed like the full sweep of these historic convictions had finally run their course, another familiar face appeared in the dock. Not a variety show host this time, but a trusted weatherman. Fred Talbot, a man who used to point at clouds on morning TV, now under a much darker kind of scrutiny. 12. Fred Talbot. Fred Talbot had a gimmick. While most weathermen pointed vaguely at pixelated clouds, he stood on a floating map in the middle of the water and delivered forecasts with a cheerful awkwardness that made him oddly endearing. For a time, he was one of the most recognizable faces on regional and national British television. The man was practically a meme before memes existed. He was supposed to be safe, bland, dependable. That was the point of TV weather personalities. Reliable presences who made the unpredictable feel manageable. But the predictability was a lie. Talbot's fall came later in life, long after his television career had faded, when most had forgotten his name entirely. But when allegations surfaced of indecent assaults committed decades earlier, the past snapped back into the present with precision. In 2015, Talbot was convicted of multiple offenses against teenage boys and sentenced to 4 years in prison. A later case brought more time. Another 8 months added to his record. What made the coverage feel uniquely dissonant was the sheer ordinariness of his past image. Talbot wasn't bombastic or theatrical. He wasn't a larger-than-life persona like some of the others who fell. He was genial, middle-aged, mild, and in that contrast between appearance and action, his case cut especially deep. Like Stuart Hall and Rolf Harris, Talbot's offenses were historic. Long unprosecuted, long unacknowledged. And like them, his conviction fit into the wider post-Savile reckoning that forced Britain to reassess its trust in familiar figures. The institutions that once granted him a platform now moved swiftly to disown him. Archive footage was pulled. Media retrospectives cut him out like a contaminated frame. But while the legal proceedings gave closure, they didn't erase the discomfort. Talbot's face had been a background character in so many lives, just another part of morning routines and childhood memories. And that's what made the betrayal feel personal. He wasn't just a name on a charge sheet. He was in the living room, day after day, smiling gently while hiding something else entirely. It's a brutal sort of narrative symmetry, the way public trust builds over time and collapses in an instant. But not every story on this list is about conviction. The final name belongs to a figure who might not have served time at all, at least not in any provable way. Sarah Churchill's prison tale remains a whisper, a rumor, a ghost story in the margins of British fame. 13. Sarah Churchill. Some reputations are forged in scandal, others are haunted by it. Sarah Churchill, the actress daughter of Winston Churchill, falls into the latter category, a life shaped less by what she did than by what people said she might have done. Among the many rumors orbiting her name, one persists above the rest, that she spent time in Holloway prison for drunk and disorderly behavior. The story crops up in scattered biographies and late-night trivia forums. Some versions place her in a cell for a few days. Others suggest it was merely a stint on remand. But the odd thing is, for all its repetition, there's very little hard evidence. No mainstream court documentation, no definitive archival reporting. Just that classic whisper repeated so often, it starts to sound like truth. And why does it stick? Because it fits. Because Sarah Churchill's life, though cloaked in aristocratic lineage, was a messy, dramatic tangle of rebellion and restlessness. She was a gifted performer with a sharp wit, a defiant streak, and a complicated relationship with the press. She starred in films like Royal Wedding, alongside Fred Astaire, yet headlines often paid more attention to her drinking, her divorces, her volatility. The idea that she might have wound up in a jail cell at some point doesn't feel like a stretch, but that doesn't make it a fact. This is where history gets murky, not in what happened, but in what we need to believe happened. The alleged Holloway episode is plausible, yes. It would have been era-appropriate, quietly managed, and politely buried, especially for the daughter of a wartime prime minister. But without a paper trail, it remains hearsay. A biographical footnote trying to pass as a headline. It also reveals something deeper about how Britain treats legacy. Sarah Churchill was not merely a celebrity, she was a Churchill. Her failures were amplified, her defiance magnified. The system that might have quietly punished someone else punished her publicly, but ambiguously. If she was jailed, it was concealed. If she wasn't, the rumor itself became the punishment. And so, Sarah remains suspended in the strange purgatory between myth and memory. Not quite exonerated, not quite convicted. Just another figure whose real story is drowned out by the echo of a juicier one. Which, perhaps, is the most British fate of all. Not to be scandalized, but to be speculated about endlessly.